Anas, would you like to share the
I've
results?
just shared the screen. I've just shared the survey. Um, the second survey is right there on the chat.
Yazar, Amit
Yes.
is asking for entry. Can you just text with him?
Uh, he's, of course, I will.
Just send him a link on his WhatsApp.
Yeah.
Thank you. Patience, I like that. Yeah. So interestingly, a lot of us are thinking patience, but patience doesn't solve problems necessarily, right? We've got to also begin thinking about practical solutions that can at least, if not solve the problem before us, at least show us a path out of it. And yes, we'll have to do it with cooperation, with patience, with balance, in a planned manner, following rules, staggering perhaps a series of solutions, slowly exiting, not necessarily overnight, the way we went into lockdown. Anas, may I take over the screen now, please? Great. So I'm just going to talk to you over the next 1.5 hours about the thoughts that are on my mind about getting out of this lockdown. And these are really the two tools that I've spent a fair amount of time over the last few years thinking about, typically using them in a different context. But my sort of cursory understanding, I think there is application and applicability to the pandemic response that we find ourselves faced with today. So just to get us started, right? COVID-19, it's a national catastrophe. We all know this. How bad is it really? I want to present a quick summary of where India stands in containing and managing the spread of SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus, and COVID is, of course, the result of contracting that virus. The time-tested approach for communicable diseases is trace, test, isolate, and treat, but at scale. SARS-CoV-2 is a communicable disease, but it is slightly different in that it is highly infectious. It's a novel strain. We know very little about it. There is no vaccine, no treatment thus far. We know that it poses high risks to the elderly, given that it affects the respiratory system so badly. And in particular, also those with comorbidities. So like, for example, diabetes, blood pressure, heart ailments, etc. There has been a global variation in approaches, but a few things are sort of pretty clear. One is that social distancing works well. And second is that it is not mutually exhaustive with rapidly scaling testing mechanisms and healthcare delivery readiness. Our approach in India has been a drastic lockdown combined with selective tracing, testing, and treating. There are two challenges with this. Distancing is important, but distancing only sort of subdues it, and it gives us some time to prepare, but it doesn't fix the problem that we are at its heart, right? Over the last few days, we've all seen the images of all of the all of the troubles that the lockdown has brought, from ending shops completely, everything is shuttered down, to the vast number of poor migrants that are trying to make their way back home, given that they're not able to pay rents in where they live or afford basic essentials. We're seeing entire communities convert into containment zones. My parents' home in Bombay, my parents' district in Bombay has been converted into an entire containment zone. And we are seeing, sort of all of these images of people trying to figure out how to deal with the anxiety of and the uncertainty around COVID. Where is India in terms of, taking stock of the spread of the virus? As of 26th April, we have tested about 625,000 samples. of which we find about, sort of 26,000 samples odd as being positive, testing positive for COV2. That's about a 4.2% ratio. Tests per million. This has become sort of the global benchmark that folks around the world are tracking. We're currently testing 462 per million people, of which about 20 are turning out to be positive. I just want to draw your attention. I mean, this is also a beautiful project that you should consult. Our World in Data, Hassel and all have put together testing data from around the world and presented it in these beautiful graphs, very compelling graphs. India is really, really low on the total number of tests that it has done. Remember that it's been about 6 to 8 weeks since we find ourselves in this situation. And compared to the rest of the world who have rapidly escalated their testing, we are not faring as well. In particular, the number of tests that we do per day is grossly insufficient for the size and scale of our country. Of course, it is also in keeping with our capabilities, both in the public sector and the private sector as it stands. The tests per day is a benchmark that is globally used and serves as a very useful reference point when you're comparing between countries as well. And I'm going to come back to the test per day question a little later. So what of all of these numbers, right? One way of thinking about it is really what we don't know doesn't harm us, right? There is no cure, so what's the point of knowing all of these numbers anyway? There are a few different things. I'm by bent a researcher, so I like to understand what's really going on. One is, I think, if we understand the prevalence better, it helps us plan and mitigate better. Second is, of course, a practical story, right? How feasible is it to keep prolonging this? How long are we going to shut everything down? There are shortages that are imminent, both labor shortages as well as goods and services, right? State capacity. It takes a lot to keep a country locked down. Everything from police to district administration to, of course, all other attendant capacity. And just the fact that we're a country of 1.3 billion people. How long can you keep this group shut down? Economic activity has come to a standstill. We're estimating that our GDP will go somewhere, the forecast will drop from 4.5% to about 1 to 2% in what some say is an optimistic scenario. This is catastrophe for us. There is no air or rail travel. So think about all of the people that are stuck, not having any recourse to be able to go even in cases of emergencies. And then, of course, the human costs, right? We've seen all of the pictures of migrants who are stuck, children who are shut off from school and therefore parents having to cope, and the general anxiety that is prevalent among all of us. And along with all of this, there is no clear end in sight. Technically, they say that the lockdown ends on May 3rd. The trouble with this is I think a bunch of states have already made demands to prolong this. The Center for Disease Dynamics and Economics and Policy on March 24th predicted that by July, we're looking at an infection rate of about 300 to 400 million people. Just take a minute to think about that number, right? The question isn't about whether people will die as a result of this. The question is then it becomes really, really hard to control. And given that we don't have enough hospital beds, given that state capacity is so weak, how are we going to cope with the aftermath of these many cases, right? And then, of course, there are a whole bunch of other kinds of studies that are telling us what those numbers could look like, what we should start to be nervous about, why this is such a big sort of deal. So the question that I've been pondering over the last couple of weeks is, look, at some point we're going to have to end the lockdown, right? Whether we do it overnight, whether we do it in a staggered fashion, it doesn't matter. We've got to go back to some semblance of normalcy. What conditions will make this possible? Many states have already begun to constitute what are called de-lockdown committees with very smart people on them who are looking at a slew of different options to help us come out of lockdown. I want to present to you as a way of brainstorming more than anything else, two such ideas that I hope that you will sort of think about, advocate if you think these are useful, and hopefully also understand and study further. Unless I think there are a number of questions. Okay, no, there aren't. Sorry. So making our way out of lockdown, what big problems do we need to solve? I've listed a few of them. The first is, I think we need to have a real unfiltered view on prevalence, spread, and speed. So as I mentioned to you earlier, our approach in India at the moment is to selectively test. It means that uh, the numbers are not really the real numbers, right? They are the numbers based on how many people we have tested, and we've tested very few people. So we don't actually know how many people are infected with SARS-CoV-2, how many people are ill with COVID, how many people are ill in a deep way, and and given also our death tracking systems, we don't have a good sense of how many people have actually died of COVID. By the way, there is a great article by some of our friends at the IDFC Institute, Ruben Abraham and them, who've talked about the death rate around COVID in India and why it poses such a puzzle. You might also find it really interesting. The second is we do need to restart economic activity. We need to start travel, particularly train travel. We need to start movement of goods and services. We need to open up ports. We need to open up shops, industries, services, all of the attendant. And we need to help those who have been badly hit by the lockdown with some form of assistance. Longer term, we need to start growing again, growing quickly. India had already started to see an economic slowdown. And with this massive hit, it will take us a long time to recover. We need to catch up and pick up pace quickly. And last but not least, we need to rapidly increase healthcare delivery capability for the long haul, right? One of the big things with COVID-19 is that most people are asymptomatic. Most people, the symptoms are mild. But when it does hit you in a bad way, it means we need beds, we need ventilators, we need respiratory assistance, and a whole slew of intensive care responses, which we don't have at the moment. I want to focus on the first three because I think that the solutions I'm proposing have the most direct bearing on these three. And these are, just to quickly repeat, one, to have a real unfiltered view on the data. Second is to restart economic activity. And third is to help those who need assistance the most. How do we go about doing this? I propose two solutions, or two instruments rather. The first is using vouchers for testing, for rapidly increasing the number of people that India tests. The second is a means-tested unconditional cash transfers. And I will go into each of these in a little bit of detail, mostly sort of focusing on what do you need to put in place in order to design these two instruments. First, let's test. How do we test? Before we start anything, my nudge is always, let's have clarity on the objective, right? What do we want to accomplish by testing so much? First, the big problem with infectious diseases is the externalities, right? If I'm ill, I'm very likely to make you ill. And if you don't know that I'm ill and you're sort of roaming around in the economy, then that increases the risks to everybody around you, right? Externalities, particularly negative externalities, are problematic. We need to figure out a good way to solve for these externalities. Second is that, if you remember earlier, I mentioned this tests per day number. Experts estimate that even conservatively speaking, India needs to ramp up to 250,000 tests per day very, very quickly. And this is again, keeping in mind the feasibility and our state capacity and sort of the troubles and poverty that we find ourselves mired in. In 6 weeks, just to sort of give you perspectives, we've done about 625,000 tests in total. So just let that sink in. We're supposed to do 250,000 tests per day, but we've in a span of 6 weeks, we've done about 625,000 tests. How do we go from here to testing en masse? Who do we test? How often do we test them? What test do we use? Why should I get tested? Who will do the testing? Who will pay for the testing? Who will monitor once I am tested? So the solution that, just to break this task down a little bit further, right? The solution will need to do a bunch of different things. One is that it has to be useful. I'm only going to get tested if it it is of some value to me, if there is an incentive for me to opt in. Second, it has to be scientifically robust, right? So not just any test, not just one-time tests, but high frequency repeat tests based on the different protocols that are associated with the different types of tests in the market. Second is it has to be context appropriate. What works for Sweden, what works for Singapore, what works for South Korea, what works for the United States does not work for us. We are a different beast. We are deeply mired in poverty. We are deeply mired in state capacity constraints. And along with it, we have a density problem. So all of these things together make our situation really, really difficult to manage. It has to be implementable, right? It can't just be something that is feasible for a large country to do, large country or rich country to do, but not feasible for us to do. And lastly, it has to be cost effective. Whether I have to pay for it out of my own pocket or whether somebody else is going to foot the bill for me, it has to be cost effective. What has India done so far on the story of testing? First, it started with establishing government monopoly on testing. It said that ICMR will approve government labs and government labs only will test. 2 weeks later, we retracted this because we realized that this is a fool's errand and started to allow private labs to test. Next, we set up absurd 100% specificity and sensitivity demands for test kit approvals, right? Nowhere in the world do you establish for any kind of test, forget COVID tests, for any kind of tests, you do not expect 100% positive rate on or 100% negative rate on a test. Then we said, oh, right, that doesn't make any sense. So we'll allow for alternative testing approval routes. So ICMR is one route. But in addition to ICMR, if you have had US FDA approval or EU approval, we'll allow you into our markets. The third thing we did is we went ahead and set a price ceiling. We said if you're doing an antibody test, you can't charge more than 1,500 rupees. If you are doing an RT-PCR test, you can't charge more than 3,000 rupees. If you are doing home-based testing, either serology or RT-PCR, we'll give you can't charge more than 1,000 rupee premium. Then came the SC order. The SC said free tests by the private sector for everybody. And quickly retracted, both under government pressure and private sector pressure, and said, actually, this is only for the poor. Then the Pradhan Mantri Ayushman Bharat scheme said that COVID-19 testing will be offered to all of its beneficiaries. Except that one big problem with this is the agreements under Ayushman Bharat are with hospitals, not with labs. And largely testing is done by labs, not by hospitals. Okay, so here is where I want to, let me take a second and see if there are any questions. Anas?
Yes, we have questions. I'll share the screen on that.
Great. I'll stop my share. Okay. Social distancing is necessary for flattening the curve. I'm going to talk about JAM in a little bit, Puneet, so I'll come back to that a little bit later. The outbreak, a chance to bring major economic reforms. Actually, Kartikeya, I'm not dealing with that today. I want to talk very, very specifically about certain issues. Sorry, Anas, I think it's, can you scroll down a little bit? On a policy level, what should be the appropriate fiscal strategy to fund cash vouchers, centrally driven or with federalist collaboration? Gurkirat, I will come to that question in a bit. People in slums are facing housing crisis and sanitation. Lockdown won't help them. I'm going to come to a couple of solution ideas in a bit. I don't know if it solves all the problems, but potentially at least part of the problem. Do we have feasibility to test everyone in our country? $1 million question. Arpit, I'm going to come show you some numbers on this in a little while. How could we have averted the current socio-economic menace? I have no idea. This is a hard question to answer, and I'm no soothsayer. I think there are things we could have done better, but that's a subject for another day. Don't you think India has blindly copied the West in its response? It's not clear to me. I don't think there is a West versus East binary. I think there are different types of combinations that have been used. There is no East versus West. What is different is there are some governments that have used the heavy hand of the state, some governments that have not used the heavy hand of the state, and that's sort of the big difference. What are the disease spreads to rural India? The disease has already spread to rural India. Let's not bury our head in the sand that it has not done so. How do you suggest resuming the economy so soon? I don't yet. I want to think about it a little bit more. Are there more questions, Anas?
No, currently these are all. There's one more that's come just now. Here it is.
Okay. Can restoring economic activity solve the issue? Since there is widespread consumer anxiety. Great question. I'm going to come to this in a minute. And how long can the government provide free stuff to people at current rate? Great question. I'm going to come back to that as well. Anas, let me take over the screen if that's okay. Anas, would you do me a favor? A couple of the questions that I've sort of highlighted as tackling in a little while, would you just make a note of them?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Great. All right, let me share screen again. I just want to quickly flag that it's a mistake to try and solve everything at one go. I think you want to use your bandwidth towards solutions that one you are familiar with, towards very particular objectives that are solvable, and in a way that is sort of high on technical correctness and administrative feasibility. And sort of that's where I'm focusing today's conversation. I don't pretend to have answers to all the questions. Can we come out of a lockdown tomorrow? Can we? How do we solve our fiscal crisis? What should the entire bailout package look like? There are 1,000 questions. I certainly don't have answers to all of them. I've got ideas about two things. One is a staggered exit out of lockdown, and second is making life a little bit easier for the poor. And these are the two things that I'm going to focus on in this talk. Okay, so back to testing. Now, given that we've made a few mistakes in our testing strategy, and given also the importance of testing in the scheme of things, suppose we were to use a different instrument, right? One instrument is the government says, I will test in my hospital. The other is the government says, do what you want. But suppose you took a slightly different view and said, because there are externalities and because we want to ramp up capacity really quickly, what if we thought of a different instrument? The instrument I have in mind is voucher, for the lack of a better word. And this instrument does two things. One, it recognizes that government capacity to test, meaning to provide and conduct the tests, is insufficient. There are about 176 government approved labs that are doing testing at the moment. Far many more labs need to be testing. Second is that India's healthcare capacity lies in the private sector. This isn't just a sort of flight of fancy. There are a number of really high quality studies that point to this. It may not all be A grade, but the capability, whatever we have, lies in the private sector. A large part of it lies in the private sector. Jishnu Das has a fantastic series of work on it. I think Shruti Rajgopalan has done a quick little survey of our healthcare capability, and there are a number of other studies on this as well. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, Accountability Initiative a few days ago did a fantastic, Center for Policy Research a few days back did a fantastic podcast on this. So I encourage you to listen to it. Okay, why do I say that testing capability lies in the private sector? Today, there are over 1 lakh labs operational in this country, right? About 50%, well, 40% of those labs are standalone laboratories. The lab industry comprises of regional chains, national chains, standalone laboratories, etc., etc. It turns out that the 3 largest chains, lab chains in India, have a presence in at least half of India's poorest districts. This is a study by Niti Aayog, right? So as far as the question of, well, will private labs be able to test in remote parts of the country? Perhaps not everywhere, But in large swathes of the country, the answer is a resounding yes. The private sector is nervous about stepping up, particularly with the Supreme Court order and with the price ceilings. It takes a lot to set up capability to do testing. Let me give you a small example. To set up an RT-PCR testing facility, you would have to have the machine, or you'd have to get the machine. If you already had the machine, you would also have to sort of create a isolation zone in your existing lab, right? You don't want COVID-19, those who are coming in for SARS-CoV testing, to mix with those who are coming in with for other testing. You'd have to either let that other capacity lie fallow, or you'd have to figure out a way to isolate. This is really hard to do. I mean, think about the kind of task we're setting up. The private sector is also nervous because government monopolies around the world have jacked up the prices of test kits. What do we mean by test kits? Really, we are talking about what are called disposable units in test kits, right? Meaning the reagents, for example. Yeah, where the private sector would have bid $10 to $15 per unit of reagent, governments have come in and said, we will give the supplier $50. Think about the price distortion that has come up. Now the private sector says this is just not worth my time. Then the private sector has to get in queue, because first the government will do approvals, opening up of the ports for all of its own labs, and then to the private sector. So everything in terms of logistics that the private sector could have handled really, really well, we have kind of messed up. So we need to correct for that very quickly. And simultaneously, there is enough value in saying that we want to minimize out-of-pocket spending. In healthcare literature, the concept of out-of-pocket spending is a frequently referred concept. The idea is that disposable income in the hands of particularly the poor is limited as it is. And you don't want to stress their resources out too much, because then they will compromise on the kind of healthcare they seek, the kind of investments they make. About 40 crore people in India, roughly. The numbers vary between private surveys, which say that the number is about 218 crore, 28 crore, to IRDAI, which is the insurance regulator in India, who says it's about 47 crore. So I've taken some kind of a midpoint. So about 40 crore people in India are roughly covered by private insurance. Why is this relevant? Because since the last 3 weeks, private insurance companies have been beaming messages saying that we will cover you for COVID testing as well as COVID treatment. About 15 crore cards have been issued under Ayushman Bharat. When Ayushman Bharat said we will cover for COVID, they said 50 crore citizens will be covered. But since then, some smart folks have gone and looked at the numbers, and really about 12 to 15 crore e-cards have actually been issued under the scheme. What happens to the rest? Remember, we are 1.3 billion people, right? 130 crore. It's a huge number of people that still need to be covered in some form or fashion. All right? Okay. So how do we go about designing this voucher? Sorry, I want to go back here for a second. Why is voucher useful? What we are saying is there is a role for government to do the financing, but maybe not necessarily the actual provision of testing. Yeah. So the voucher comes in because it is private provisioning and public funding, and therefore public funding to all, or at least via say means testing to certain categories of people. How do we go about designing this voucher really? First, you need to negotiate with the private sector and say, we will pay you for doing a certain number of tests. This is in healthcare literature. This is called strategic purchasing. What are the elements to this? At what price will the government buy? So how much money will the government give the private sector per test? What kind of a contract do we employ? Is it a per unit sale? Or is it to say that, whatever happens, the government will buy 100,000 tests from you, right? Meaning that it will buy the option, it will guarantee that irrespective of how many people get tested, we will pay for 100,000. Or is it a take or pay contract? Or is it an options based contract? Meaning that we will at least pay for 50,000 tests. Anything over that, we will give you on a per unit basis. right? So this contract could take a number of different forms. Ideally, it should be an options-based test, because the private sector will turn around and say, listen, for me to set up labs in different places and set up the capability, I need to do advanced investment. I need to have working capital to do this. What is my guarantee that I will have an order flow, right? So there are all sorts of problems that you need to be able to solve for. And lastly, private sector can cheat. It can scam and say we did 100,000 tests, but really do 20,000 tests. What elements in the contract will incentivize good behavior, right? How will you monitor for this behavior? So what do we need to do? We need to do procurement cleanly. India does not is doing better now, but very far on how you do government procurement in a clean and transparent, accountable way. Right? We have not learned the hygiene, or we have not employed the hygiene of procurement yet. Second element, what is the front end interface with consumers? So here is how the model that I have in mind works. Suppose I'm feeling a little flu-y, right? I have a bit of a dry cough, a little bit of a low-grade fever. What do? I should be able to go to any health testing facility and say, listen, these are my symptoms. Somebody refers me and says, okay, either you get a serology test or you get a RT-PCR test. Here is a voucher that I'm cutting from my book. And this means that there is no spending from your pocket. Go get tested, right? And then I go to the phlebotomist who takes my sample. Somebody records it in the back end, and so on and so on. So the element 2 is the front end interface for the consumers. And there are a number of questions that we need to answer here. First, how do we identify and target beneficiaries? Like I said to you, some folks are covered under insurance. Some folks are covered under Ayushman Bharat. Some folks may have other kinds of recourse. Some folks may have neither of these two, but may be willing to pay. So there's a whole host of these kinds of things that you want to think about. Well, broadly, there are two strategies to identify and target beneficiaries, right? One is particular identity-based groups. So say, for example, SC/ST. Say, for example, persons with disabilities. Say, for example, minorities. Say, for example, women, right? So these are identity-based groups. The second is what is called means testing. So suppose you were what we call below poverty line, or Antyodaya Yojana beneficiaries, or National Food Security beneficiary, or those who are getting an old age pension, right? These are all means tested schemes. And that is one way of being able to identify who is the beneficiary that should be covered by such a testing voucher. What database do you use, right? One thought on my mind is that you need to think of a database that is most comprehensive, that has most recently been set up, that has at least had a few studies done on that scheme, so that you can mitigate for type 1 inclusion and exclusion errors. If you want to use biometric based identification, you need to have biometric machines deployed in all of these places. How do we do that? How does a customer actually use the scheme? So say, for example, telemedicine. This is an incredible tool that technology has made available to us. Can we use telemedicine to say, hey, go get tested, or for referrals to say, go to this particular lab and get tested, and then to get incentivized to make that referral. How do we encourage consumers to get tested? One of the stories that I hear coming out is that there is enormous stigma around this testing, right? So how do I make it worth their while to get tested? Do they get an incentive if they get tested? Are there other back-end things that you need to do? I'm going to tackle some of these in a second, but I'll leave these questions with you. What does this require us to do? This requires us to do a few specific things. One, behavior communications, right? It requires us to do a certain level of unique identity management. It requires us to have clean beneficiary databases, or at least as clean as possible under the current circumstances. There is a third element to this, which is data management. So what from all this testing? Suppose we did 250,000 tests a day. What happens then? Somebody has to be able to look at the data. Somebody has to be able to understand, analyze patterns from the data. Somebody has to be able to discern and say, oh, actually, this means we need to change strategy, that actually the antibody tests don't work as well as the RT-PCR test. Somebody needs to be able to monitor and manage the data. So how do we create a case tracking system? How do we, particularly that is interfaced with all of these private labs? How do we incentivize reporting into the system, right? Why should I report to you on? I'm already doing the test. In addition to it, I also have to fill up some kind of e-system that says this person got tested on this date, data was positive / negative, and this person's ID and information is XYZ, right? How will we catch rigging and cheating? What kind of intellectual capability do we need to deploy to be able to analyze the data? How does this data that we collect speak to other data systems? So for example, we have one voucher system here. We have insurance companies that are doing their own vouchering. You also have Ayushman Bharat that has its own MIS, right? So for example, how do all of these systems talk to each other? And most importantly, who's in charge of the data? Who runs the system? Who makes sure that the monitoring is happening at high frequency, etc., etc., etc. What does this require us? This requires us to have capability in data monitoring. This requires us to think about referrals and incentives and the money that may be required to be deployed towards referrals and incentives, in addition to the cost that we bear for the voucher itself. Okay, I want to stop here for a second and take any questions that may be coming in. Anas?
Yes, I'll share my screen.
Great, thank you.
Here you are. So first question is the highest voted question.
Which is the question that's the highest voted question?
The first one you see on your screen. How long can the government continue to provide
Right.
fees?
I just want to wait on this because I'm not dealing with cash transfers yet. I'm dealing specifically with testing vouchers. I will get to cash transfers in a second and think about the challenges there. Okay. I haven't come to cash transfers yet. Let's tackle this question. Do we have feasibility to test everyone in this country? No, we don't. But we don't need to test everyone. We need to do a certain number of tests a day so that in the aggregate, we are able to see patterns. That's what we want more than anything else, right? So how do we set up this feasibility to test this number? So instead of more importantly, it's not just about testing everyone once, right? So to give you an example, the antibody test, it turns out that you really want to be able to test people at a frequency of about once every 7 days, right? With the RT-PCR test, it might be about 14 days, right? Because in the interim, we don't know yet that once you've had, suppose you've contracted it, you don't get it again. We don't know that for sure. We don't even know how much time it takes to incubate. So these are all questions that are not settled yet. So my response to that, Arpit, is that let's rephrase the question and say, instead of thinking about feasibility of testing 1.3 billion people, let's think about number of samples that we need to get tested every day. That becomes a far easier problem to break down. And once we are able to get to a 250,000 number, it becomes a lot easier to go to a 500,000. I hope that is a useful response. How do you suggest resuming the economy so soon? I don't. I am just sort of bouncing off some ideas with you on ways that we might be able to do a staggered exit. Do you think encouraging privatization would lead the way for monopolies? And if the price ceiling is broken under the stress of the same, correction would be difficult. Great question. Here is the thing though. The market, the diagnostic testing market in India is wonderfully diverse and wonderfully competitive. As I showed you a little while earlier, the number that we are using is about 1 lakh labs that are operational in the country, right? About 50% of these are some form of chain enterprises. 50% of these are standalone shops. So as it is, the market is wonderfully competitive, and we're only getting into the market to say, let's use this existing infrastructure, rather than saying that we are building new private sector enterprises that could do this testing. right? So that's point one. The second is in terms of price ceilings. Now, while that, my sense is, over the last few days, I've had the chance to talk to a number of lab providers or lab company executives, and their thinking is, if we can get scale, the cost of the tests will go down. So where the government has set for 4,500 rupees, instead of that, actually we are able to do it at about 2,500 rupees. So I think the price ceiling does the opposite. What it does is it creates an artificial number, which it is hard to correct. So what you want is that when there is competition, better tests start to come in, people start to examine and look at economies of scale and bring prices down. The third element to the price is also in how the government negotiates the value of the voucher. This is easier said than done, no question about it. It isn't easy to negotiate between government and the private sector, but what we have seen is that India has done this before. We have done this in the case of TB testing, and we've successfully deployed a voucher type system, encouraging everybody from pharmacists to Ayush workers to labs to hospitals. Every single part of the healthcare value chain was given a voucher or was empaneled into this voucher mechanism. Uh, and we found that prices went down, reporting increased, the ability to deal with hotspots increased. So there were an enormous number of benefits that came from it, and there are some lessons there. Okay, in a country where government data is so unreliable, how do we rely on such data-heavy solutions? Great question. We're not saying we are relying on government data. What we are saying is there a way to be able to generate private data more than anything else? And yes, do some amount of corroboration. Now, one way to limit inclusion and exclusion errors is to say everyone is covered, right? So irrespective of whether you're rich and poor, we are going to, because there are externalities and we want to solve for this, we are going to cover everybody's testing. If you show up at a lab, your testing is free. So that's my sense is getting around the data problem of beneficiary selection. I think that may be the best way of doing it. Alternatively, what we do know is that one of the more recent databases, beneficiary databases that has been set up is under the National Food Security Act. And there have been a number of tests and tries around it, as well as studies that have shown that, yes, there are inclusion and exclusion, but compared to other schemes, we've done something to minimize it more than anything else because it is recent. The third element of this, and of course, the most tricky element of this, is using UID. Given that UID coverage is probably the most extensive in this country, there is value in exploring it. Of course, there are perils with using UID, which is Aadhaar, around questions of privacy, around questions of Big Brother, around questions of use and sale of data. These are not trivial questions, and I won't presume to sort of brush it under the carpet, but these are ways of thinking about the problem more than anything else. Okay. What are the chances that the private sector will step up despite so many restrictions from government and the Supreme Court, ignoring their business propaganda? I have no idea what the latter part of the question means, but the first part of the question. So I've had, like I said, I've had a chance to talk to a number of those in the lab business, and they say we are happy to step up. But what we do want is, and we're happy to step up even with the price ceiling. So the 4,500, the 1,500 plus slash 3,000 plus 1,000 formula works for us. We can make it work at scale. The trouble is you need to get out of the way of procuring test kits. So let the market work competitively. Let government not hog test kits. This is a problem which will require sort of government to take a very mature view. I don't know how we do it, but at least it's worth arguing for and sort of deploying persuasion to get government to stop monopolizing the queuing of test kits. What the private sector is saying is that as far as a willingness to engage in a voucher system goes, we are more than happy to do this kind of engagement and participation as we have in the case of HIV testing, in the case of of TB testing. We're happy to step up to the plate. However, what we don't want to do is get stuck in a bad price negotiation with the government. Like I said to you, there are a few different options on how you will structure that agreement. My sense is we've done this many times before, so it's not entirely foreign, but we need to be able to do it quickly, and therein lies the trouble. How do we deal with the acute shortage of test kit supply? To be honest, it's not clear that there is an acute shortage of test kit supply. I think what there is a problem of queuing, because most governments have come up and started to monopolize it. I don't have a good answer to how we solve this, but my sense is that the market does a pretty good job in sourcing and organizing shortages, or sort of planning around shortages. So we should at least um, keep our eyes open to this possibility that there is a solution that can emerge from the market, instead of sort of clamping it down entirely. Okay, my chat box is beaming, so I want to open. I think Parth has a comment. One way to ensure that all tests are recorded and there is no cheating is to have a unique ID on each test or barcode. We should be able to track every test kit the way Amazon tests parcels that it sends out. That's a great point. Tests in general typically do tend to be barcoded. One of the challenges, though, is that in the case of RT-PCR tests, not so much in the case of serology tests, is that one test kit services several different people. So I think the number is somewhere at economies of scale. I think if you are at at the sort of largest testing facility in this, you can test 4,000 kits. 4,000 samples at the same time using the test kit. And so there are variations in this, and you want to think about that possibility a little bit carefully. But there's no question that you want to match test kit to person to reduce the amount of the cheating possibilities that can. Okay, recognizing that there are millions of political economy questions with regard to this, are there urgent political economy questions that need to be asked? I'm not entirely clear what we mean. I'm going to take a quick stab at this. I think what we mean are how are the interests of each of the different actors aligning and playing out. It's a great question if that's what you mean. I don't have a sort of crystal clear answer for it, but I have a way of thinking about it, which is to say that it turns out that emergency situations are a nice way to be able to align around a common purpose, and we are seeing that. What we are also seeing simultaneously is the opportunities for corruption, particularly in the procurement of test kits. So to my mind, I think you want to be able to piggyback on this common purpose that has come up, along with minimizing the corruption opportunities that are cropping up. There are ways to do this. One is to reduce the amount of direct procurement that government does directly, rather than letting the private sector procure, because that is always going to be fraught with corruption possibilities. My chat box is beaming, so I'm going to look that up really question. Please take up questions with the most number of votes. Anas, am I not already doing that?
No, the questions with the most number of votes are right up here. Yeah.
Yes. How do we deal with the stigma associated with testing? If I'm found positive, I will be quarantined in a government facility, rejected by my neighbors, etc. Great point. Okay. So I thought I would tackle this a little bit in my summary slide at the end of the presentation, but let me talk about that a little bit more. Let's think about what we want, right? Why would I get tested? I would get tested if there is some benefit for me more than anything else. So one obvious benefit is that I can get healthcare if I am tested. Second benefit is that I can go back to society if I'm tested negative. Of course, if I'm tested positive, then there is a whole host of problems. With the testing positive, there is the great possibility of home-based testing. Currently, government is particularly given the cost issues around home-based testing. Private facilities are not providing as much of it, though they are most excited by that possibility. So my sense is that allowing for the market to start to enter and to operate at scale would solve this over a period of time. There's a second part to this. In the literature around vouchers and cash transfers, we find that just messaging and behavior change communication plays a huge role in influencing the choices and the approaches of beneficiaries, not just beneficiaries, also suppliers. So, for example, in the case of conditional cash transfers associated with education, as well as education vouchers, we know that simply sending out an SMS saying that this money is for the education of your child uh, take reduces the amount of fungibility of funding, increases the participation rate, increases the willingness to sign up and show up for conditions. So there is the tool of labeling that is available to us. I don't think that it's as I don't think this is something that goes away tomorrow. I think it takes a while. So as you see that more and more people get tested, and more people get tested and get negative and find entry back into society, it allows for people to sort of see the possibilities of or the positive side of testing as well. So this is my sort of short submission on this, with the full acknowledgement that this is not a settled question. Third, Bharat has a question. People who died due to underlying conditions aren't tested for coronavirus or added to the death toll according to BBC. How can we properly track all cases? Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first step to it again is to just track testing, right? Once you know how many people are positive and if they are uniquely identified, then it becomes a lot easier for us to know, to trace them, to follow them, to see where they are, to see if they need additional care, to see if they have shown up at a hospital, right? So there are multiple things that at least become more evident to us. One of the things that is happening today, and I think I mentioned the piece by Ruben Abraham and them on the death rates. And it's a really nice logical way of breaking down this question. I think one problem that we have today is that folks show up with symptoms without having been tested. So we have no idea what has happened to them at all. Combined with this, that historically our records on death are not that great. So both of these problems are sort of coming together in a not so nice way. I don't think we can solve the second problem in the short run, but we can certainly try to solve the first in the short to medium run, which is to say that at least we know how many people are positive, and therefore we have a way of being able to sort of look at the correlations of deaths that are coming in and potentially number of people who've gotten tested. So it may give us a slightly a better sense of the data, if not perfect sense of the data. How do prospects for a green economy look better? I am not going to tackle that question because it's not quite the subject matter of today's conversation. Okay, social distancing is necessary for flattening the curve. It may not be the solution, but bring cases under the line of healthcare facilities in every state. I'm not completely clear on the question. I'm not going to tackle this. I don't know the question is. Whoever has asked it, if they want to rephrase, that'll be better. Okay, perhaps I want to check real quick what questions have come up in the chat box. Top 3 ideas on how not to mismanage a pandemic, taking lessons from COVID-19. Oh, Amit, you're putting me on the spot there. I won't take bait. I think managing a pandemic is really, really hard in the best of circumstances. A government that doesn't work in the best of times, you can't expect it to work seamlessly in the worst of times. So I think we also have to be a little bit kinder on ourselves. A little earlier in the discussion, I pointed out some things where I think, which we quickly we took a step and then retracted on a number of these things. I've highlighted those in the slide deck, and I'm happy to sort of show that screen once really quickly. But aside from that, I don't want to sort of take the harsh view that these are the top 3 things that we have done to mismanage. I think we should have done some things better, but I also don't think this is an enviable task at all to be in the decision-making spot. Okay, I want to go back. Anas, may I take this screen back, please? Thank you. Okay, Amit, for your question, I'm just going to quickly go back and show you that screen once. Okay, so this is just, I'm leaving it up on the screen for a minute. So these are some ideas on things that I think we could have done better, or at least some moves that in the case of testing weren't the smartest for the situation that we had. All right, I want to sort of move on. Just give me one moment. I need to place my slides. Okay, the second part of my submission to you. So the first part was on using vouchers to increase the amount of testing we're doing. The second is on economic assistance to the poor. Over the last few days, we've all seen the amount of sort of troubles that the poorest in this country are facing, and it's going to get much, much harder, right? I think this is something that most of us are pretty clear on or have a pretty good sense of. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Bhuvana. Please
Okay,
go.
thank you. Sorry about that. The first is again following the same pattern that we used for the previous sort of solution. Let's have clarity on the objective. Right? Economic debilitation is high. In and of itself, it's a problem, but it's also a problem because it has impacts on health, nutrition, education, so on and so forth. We need a mechanism to help people tide over, particularly if income flow is likely to be closed off for the medium and the long term, right? It's not for the foreseeable future. It's going to be really difficult to see construction activity go on in full swing, or to see mass employment in urban industries, particularly in manufacturing industries. Most industries are either setting up closed loop or saying that we want to wait for a little bit longer before we bring people back onto our payrolls, right? So this is likely to continue for quite a while. There are other examples. Street vendors are something that CCS has championed for a long time. Schools, people not being able to send their children to schools, so on and so forth. So how do we get there? How do we start to provide economic assistance to the poor? There are a series of questions again that we need to answer, right? Who gets the transfers? What is the transfer amount? How often will we give this transfer? How do we enroll people? How do I get the money if I enroll? Who will pay for this cash transfer? Who will monitor what is happening with this cash transfer? So these are sort of the big questions that come up when we think about designing such a program. Any solution that we put forward will need to do the following. First, it has to be meaningful to be worth the trouble, right? So suppose the cash transfer amount is 100 rupees a month. It's just not worth my while to go to the ATM or to the bank to withdraw that money. It's just not going to be useful to me. It has to be context appropriate. Do I give money once every 6 months in somebody's bank account? Is that useful? Most people in India run their households on a 2-week basis, and we know this from data on other cash transfer studies. It has to think about bank penetration and ATM penetration in this country. It has to be implementable. It takes a lot to do a cash transfer scheme. You have to have a public finance management system all set up. You have to monitor the frequency of transfers. You have to check the money, the fund flow. I pressed send from the central kitty. It went to the state kitty. From the state kitty, it went to the district kitty. From the district kitty, it went on to the bank account. Actually, it went on to the bank. The bank has to then say, okay, I'm clearing it for transfer into person X's account. This requires an enormous amount of sort of back-end systems to be working. And lastly, it has to be cost effective, right? In order to do a transfer of 4,000 rupees, if it costs us 15,000 rupees to do it, it's probably not worth the effort. More importantly, it's probably going to spurn off a whole bunch of downstream unintended consequences. So how do we go about designing such an unconditional cash transfer? The first is the identification. Given that we are faced with an economic emergency and you want to operationalize something like this tomorrow, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. So you can't go about enrolling somebody in a brand new scheme today, saying that in 1 year later, we will give you the cash transfer for the crisis that is now. So this needs to happen right away. So we've got existing database sets that we can use. NFSA is one such. Of course, along with it, there are others that will argue that there is the JAM framework. That's another possibility. The problem with the JAM framework is that the NFSA coverage is far broader than the JAM coverage. Aadhaar coverage is very high, but of course, Aadhaar is not means tested. So what happens is that you have the Aadhaar number. If you wanted to do a universal income, then you could certainly use Aadhaar. But if you wanted to do it targeted towards those who need it the most, you'd probably need a means tested framework. In this case, the best one we have in our country for ready use is the National Food Security Database. What is the amount? We have an example. A few years ago, Government of India piloted in the Union territories cash in lieu of PDS grains. PDS is the public distribution system, the ration shops. So instead of getting grain, you would get an equivalent amount of cash in your bank account. This scheme worked reasonably well, and most people at the end of 1 year of piloting said, we actually prefer cash. This is not by any means true for everywhere in the country. This is not by any means a one size fit all solution at all. What we do know is that this allowed us to calibrate what the amount of the transfer should be. So it was not just the actual amount of what it would cost to buy food grains, but it was the actual cost of the food grains that would be given in the PDS shop, but it was what would cost you to buy an equivalent amount of grain in the market. So your NFSA entitlement typically tends to be 3 kg of wheat and 3 kg of rice and 2 kg of wheat. And what will it take today to buy 3 kg of rice and 2 kg of wheat in the market? So that's a way to think about the amount of transfer. It doesn't have to be tied only to food. We have a number of household surveys, right? We have consumption expenditure tracking that the NSSO has done previously. So we have a pretty good benchmark of what it takes to run a 4-person household. And that's a good way to be able to calibrate what the amount of the transfer should be. Tranching, how frequently do we do the transfer? What we know from cash transfer literature is more often is better than less often. This also, of course, means that we've got to have a back-end system that can do it more often than not. A good frequency for an unconditional cash transfer is 2 weeks to 1 month, right? So either every 2 weeks there is a tranche that goes into your bank account, or every month there is anything longer than that does not help when people are dealing with a cash flow crisis. Labeling. I spoke about this in the context of vouchers and stigma of testing. This is also useful in the cash transfer literature, reminding people that money is to buy food and essentials, perhaps medicines, perhaps data for their phone so they can track, allow their child to access a certain learning app, sort of different kinds of preferences that we may have as government for what people should be doing with their money. That being said, by and large, the cash transfer literature also finds that people are not as stupid as we think they are. They're also not as foolish as we think they are with their money. So one huge thing that happens with the unconditional cash transfer literature is, listen, men will drink this money away. Study after study in country after country finds that this is just not true. In fact, when you give people cash transfers, they tend to be even more careful in spending the money and tend to deploy it towards useful purposes. May not be the purpose that we intend, but it's a purpose that furthers the interest of the household more often than not. How do we do the actual transfer? So we have a Jandhan Aadhaar mobile setup, right? So we've created a back-end DBT framework. But we don't know, one of the big problems is that money goes into bank accounts, but sometimes people don't know that it's come into their bank account, or they don't know what their Aadhaar linked bank account is. A huge challenge here is that this is not a good time to be able to solve these problems, right? We're not going to be able to tell people that go check with the bank what is your Aadhaar linked bank account number. Ek baar verification dobara kar do. These are hard things to solve in the best of times. In the worst of times, they're near impossible to solve. But there is a way around this. Along with the jam infrastructure, we also have an incredible infrastructure of ration shops across the country. Most ration shops, pardon me, most ration shops across the country now are biometric enabled and are micro ATM enabled. What does this mean? Because there is a biometric authentication, a PDS grain shop is also able to act as an ATM. So this is yet another tool that we have available that we can quickly deploy. Once we've had the ration shop guy tested using his testing voucher, he can then open up his shop, and then we can begin to think about using his biometric infrastructure to be able to do to act as a micro ATM. Fund flow, center state division. I think this was also a question in the list. I think at this time, the center does need to take the onus. Many states who do have benefits of GST from previous are also deploying some of their existing resources. I think one way to think about it is to look back to the economic survey of a few years ago when Arvind Subramaniam had argued that there is merit in collapsing all of our existing subsidies into a simpler, leaner cash transfer framework. This is, this may be the time to put that idea into action. So instead of creating yet another scheme, which will mean either borrowing from the RBI's reserves or will mean printing currency eventually, or of course issuing bonds of some sort. Instead of this, perhaps what we want to do is to think about which subsidies are eliminatable. At least for a period of 3 years, we put a moratorium on some of these schemes, collapse them, get the savings, figure out how much money is available, and let the center do some of this direction. The states are always welcome to top it up with their own reserves as well. The 15th Finance Commission is deliberating as we speak, and because they are sort of thinking through what the next center state fund division looks like, this may be a good time to pose this question to them and come up with a very, very quick, responsive, COVID-tailored financing formula between center and states. What we do also want to think about is fund flow to districts and as much decentralization as is possible. The Finance Commission has already talked about direct fund flow to districts and to municipalities. This is worth doubling down on, adding to the center state PRI institutions mix. Monitoring, this phenomenal tool that was piloted by my colleagues at JPAL a few years ago, is to set up outbound call centers, where all they did is that you have the JAM framework, all you do is pick up the phone to a random number of people at very high frequency, and instead of waiting for them to call you with a grievance, you call them and say, did you receive your money last month? And doing this every 2 weeks for a random sample of people gives you a sense of what is the success rate of transfers. Are people withdrawing their money? Is this useful for them? Do they want to change something in the structure of the program? What is called a high frequency feedback mechanism. One nonprofit that has showed the way in doing this, the founder of that nonprofit also happened to be a JPAL affiliate. It's called Give Directly, and they have successfully sort of done this in many parts of Africa, many countries in Africa. It's called Give Directly, and currently, as we speak, they are doing this in the United States as well. What does setting up all this require from us? More than anything else, it requires us to check the robustness of the beneficiary list. My argument to you is from my experience and understanding of NFSA. It's among all of the beneficiary lists that we have going on in this country. This is probably the most robust means tested list that we have. If we don't want to do a means testing thing and we want to do something that is universal, then of course you'll have to consider using the UID framework. And along with this, like I said, doing some form of high frequency monitoring using outbound calls. Okay, so I want to conclude really quickly and take some more questions after this. How will all of this help? How do all of these dots start connecting? I propose to you that there are three problems that I think these tools can help solve. One is giving us a real unfiltered view on the prevalence, spread, and speed of SARS-CoV-2. The data from testing, Bharat, I think you had asked the question related to this. This quickly helps us actually see how widespread is it, where is it, what are the real hotspots, what is the clustering, what is the ebb and flow, are we in a second wave, are we in a third wave, are we sort of burying our heads in the sand? All these kinds of questions can only be answered if we have some kind of testing infrastructure. I think I've messed up my animation, so all of the points have shown up right away. We cannot close districts forever. Neighborhoods in India are notoriously permeable. They're notoriously porous. I'm sorry, that's the word. And you cannot keep districts closed forever. In particular, we also have areas in urban India that are very, very densely populated. Slums are one example. The only way to be able to do this is to have better testing going. One part of it is individual testing using vouchers. The other part of it is community testing using pooled testing that has been used in a few different countries. And we are starting to, I think, consider using it in India as well. Restarting economic activity. If I'm tested, how does this help me restart economic activity? Germany is experimenting with something as at the moment in sort of an easy pass, right? So if, for example, I have a frequency that I have to meet in terms of getting tested using vouchers, and I'm able to issue somebody movement passes, this allows credibility and allows people to engage with each other, right? So one example that I can think about is in the case of street vendors. The colony that I live in at the moment is a gated community, and they've shut us off to any kind of activity. If there were vendors, our old vendors, the ones that have been coming into this colony selling vegetables and all such for years, if they're able to quickly go get tested and have this pass, it allows them to resume earning. It allows mandis to start functioning again. It allows different types of market yards to start functioning, not just for food and grains, but for all sorts of commodities over a period of time. I'm not arguing that this happens tomorrow, but I'm saying it's a pathway to explore. You could do this in multiple ways. You could do this cluster by cluster, taking small little geographies and beginning in geographies. You could do this sector by sector, industry by industry. You could identify particular beneficiaries or particular types of people that we want to incorporate soonest and begin from there. Two examples that I just gave you, farmers and street vendors. It also allows to move. I don't know what this drooling on my, do you guys know what's happening on my screen? Anas?
I will clear it, but you've given annotate controls to everybody. So somebody's annotating by mistake.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I don't think they realize if they move their mouse, they'll make marks there.
Right. How do I?
I've cleared it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, it also allows us to move, like I said, from closed loop systems to open ones. One interesting thing I just recently learned is that some of India's largest companies are creating entirely closed communities where they are paying for everybody to be tested, but are and have set up their own contact tracing apps. Sort of like the Arogya Setu, but far more advanced, where they are tracking everybody that employees are coming in contact with. They are tracking employee symptoms. They are tracking employee movement. They are, tracking, just creating an entire framework, sort of the imagination, if you will, that we have. They're creating it in these communities. The problem is that they will just shut their doors off and not let anybody in, not let anybody out, right? We want to move away from that and allow for engagement between people to happen again. Not just from an instrumentalist point of view that people sell us goods and services, but from a humanitarian point of view, right? It's not great for us to be isolated from each other for too long. Lastly, it allows migrants to go back home. Think about Dr. K.P. Krishnan, the former Secretary of Government of India, was just telling me yesterday that in Bangalore city alone, 7 lakh migrants are still stuck waiting to go back home. They're getting increasingly anxious. They don't seem to want aid. They don't seem to want assistance. They want to go back home where they can be safe with their families, or at least feel safer with their families. How do we allow for all of these people to get back to their homes should they so choose? And lastly, like I said, helping those badly hit by the lockdown, helping them tide over difficult times by providing a quick injection of cash flow into their lives at a higher frequency than they have at the moment. So I'll end my discussion here. I will keep this last slide open, and I'm happy to take more questions. Anas, would you like to take over the screen again? Great, thank you. All right. How long can government continue to provide free stuff to people in the current rate, even in the case of government-sponsored cash vouchers? This is a great question. I think a better way to think about this question is to see how is this going to be fiscally affordable to us, and what is the sunsetting time for this? On the first question, like I mentioned, we are running 136 different schemes at the central level. At last count, there are many more schemes at the state level, as well as very specific small group schemes that are run. There is merit in collapsing all of these together, at least for a period of 3 years, if not longer. And why do I say 3 years? Some argue that we are looking at least 18 to 24 months before a vaccine becomes available in the market, vaccine or treatment becomes available in the market for for COVID-19. The trouble is, this is an optimistic scenario. The fastest vaccine that was developed was in the case of Ebola, and that took 5 years, right? So suppose the optimistic scenario plays out, we're talking about 2 years, which still means that we're looking at a difficult economic time of about 3 years. If that's the case, then you want to think about subsuming existing schemes and sunsetting this kind of a cash transfer program for potentially between 2 and 3 years. This also, by the way, gives us an opportunity to bring about long pending reforms in our social security and subsidy setup in India. So this is one way of thinking about this question. How about households not covered under NFSA? Great question. Like I said to you, there are type 1 and type 2 errors in all of India's databases, beneficiary databases. Type 1, these are inclusion and exclusion errors, right? Those who should not be getting these benefits are in the scheme. Those who should be getting these benefits are not in the scheme. That being said, I don't think there is very much that we are going to be able to do about this. What you can consider is to think is sort of decentralized assistance for some of these households. The problem is, though, that this is not a good time to be able to correct for some of these mistakes. What we do know from NFSA is that the exclusion error, which is what we worry about more than the inclusion error, is I think between 2 and 3%, which is not that high, to be honest. Yes, it means that several people are out of the ambit of being supported. I understand this, and I'm not unempathetic. But I think what I'm thinking about is, in order to get 100% success, should we be letting great be the enemy of the good, right? So that's one way of thinking through that question. A lot of women may be facing domestic violence at home, along with government cutting expenditure on social justice. How can the government solve this issue? I'm sorry, I haven't really tackled this in the talk today, so I don't think I will be responding to this. So she asks, along with the unconditional cash transfer, do you think it will be useful or worthwhile to give behavioral nudges? Gang, would you bear with me for 1 second while I turn on the lights, please? All right. Hopefully I don't look like a ghost. Sorry, to go back to that question, along with the unconditional cash transfers, do you think it will be useful or worthwhile to give behavioral nudges? So SMS, advertisements, etc., to use compliance? Absolutely, Sushil. I think I raised this earlier. This is in the literature around vouchers and cash transfers. This is called labeling. And you can call them nudge as well, sure. Yes, this has been tested multiple times in multiple contexts, both with unconditional cash transfers as well as vouchers, smart cards, and a whole host of these. These have been found to be enormously successful and useful. Along with these, there are other kind of interesting nudges that you can also pair on, right? We've already done that in some way with our subsidy schemes, where we give money into the woman's bank account, for example, right? Or where we tend to use social audits. We tend to use the panchayat to be able to disseminate some of this information. So there is a whole host of tools, behavioral communication tools, or nudges, if you like to call them, that have been tested that are plenty documented in the literature. One cool thing that happened in the case of TB testing was that pharmacists and Ayush workers were empaneled, and they were given sort of regular SMSs by the government saying that, hey, have you recently discovered in your neighborhood anybody suffering from these symptoms? Would you consider helping them or referring them for testing? And that also was a great way to bring folks who are frontline healthcare delivery personnel but who are not connected into these kinds of systems. So it was a very successful way of engaging with people. Puneet, you are asking what are the problems with JAM? I think I've tackled this to some extent. There are three issues broadly with JAM. One is the Jan Dhan accounts. I think that's the biggest challenge that we have. Since 2014, there were multiple rounds of enrolling people into Jan Dhan, and bankers were given incentives to enroll people into Jan Dhan. So what ended up happening is a lot of the times people were enrolled twice, thrice, four times, five times, right? And what happens at the back end with the JAM is the most recent account becomes your primary account to receive benefits in. This may not be your primary account from, sort of that in your memory, right? The system has said this is your primary account, but this may not be your primary account. So this is one sort of particular problem. And we saw this in the case of cash for food in the union territories. But since then, the government has also sort of done a lot of cleaning up of the Jan Dhan account databases. Aadhaar enrollment is about 1.2 crores, so there's no, there are privacy issues around Aadhaar that have not been fixed yet. But I think before we say that let's just discard UID completely, maybe we want to quickly put in place some kind of privacy safeguards to help us use that infrastructure. And the third is with mobile. We find that mobile penetration across India has skyrocketed, and most households, not all households by any means, do have at least one mobile phone in the household. And so this presents a great opportunity more than a challenge. Okay, Sushil has another interesting question, another curveball for me. Are there any bottlenecks in the state incentivizing car manufacturers to produce ventilators? Sushil, to be honest, I haven't studied this, so I won't venture into areas that I'm not that familiar with. On a policy level, what should be the appropriate fiscal strategy to fund vouchers? I think I've answered this question. Yeah. What lessons do we learn about our labor data and lack of policies for migrants? I don't think I will tackle this question because that's a huge subject matter, and I want to stay more narrow. Do you think the systemic issues in the PDS infrastructure have been exacerbated by the pandemic? Can the government effectively rely on PDS right now? To deliver food, my sense is no. We should not be using my views on the PDS system, I think, have been plenty clear. I think it has distorted prices. It has messed up our agri ecosystem. It has spoiled our environment. It has has had huge impacts on our nutrition by forcing us to eat polished grains. So I think the PDS infrastructure is generally drastically messy. Is it exacerbated by the pandemic? I'm sure it will be exacerbated. In what ways, I don't know. I do think, though, that the PDS network presents an opportunity because we do have touch points to be able to interface with the public. The question is, how do we use these touch points? India has had a very low positivity rate of 4.6%. Is testing widely the solution? Well, we don't know. We just don't know, right? And we don't know whether it is low positivity rate, whether it is our systems are messed up, whether it is that somebody is really bungling back in data, whether it is somebody is underreporting, whether just it's too soon to tell. We just don't know. So my sense is that testing more, yes, there are plenty who take the fatalistic approach that what's the point of testing so much? I see the wisdom in that. My approach tends to be that you cannot fight what you don't know. And at the moment, we are sort of fighting the unknown. And without data, it's just not, my sense is that then the only other option to this is continue to be lockdown. Do you think giving vouchers or making the testing free of cost will make early detection of cases? Affordability remains an issue. I want to do a quick time check. I think we are out of time. Yazad, Anas, how do we?
We are out of time, and I'm going to take this opportunity for everybody to kind of fill in our feedback form that's in the Zoom window. It would really help us get feedback on both Bhuvana's session as well as the format that we've been doing, because we've been trying out this format, anew. This is the first time we've had a CCS eBaithak.
So Yazad, do I continue or stop?
It's completely up to you. If you'd like to continue, we're happy to have this run for a few more minutes.
Sure, great. I'm happy to take a few more questions if that's helpful. Do you think giving vouchers or making the test free of cost will make early detection of cases? Affordability remains the main issue for most of them, yes. I think the latter question I've sort of tackled, that the voucher helps solve the who pays problem. On the former, will it allow for early detection of cases? I think if the expectation is that we start the system today and tomorrow suddenly we'll have full view of the data, I think that's wrong. I think what will happen is that it will take us a little bit of time to get, one, for people to start using the vouchers, two, for production and capability to be up and running, and three, for the data to become visible. My sense is that 3 months is a good window in which we will start to see early detection as well as an ability to be able to see geographic spread and prevalence. I think I've already dealt with this question on monopolies and privatization, Anas. Yeah, recognizing that I've answered this as well. How feasible is telemedicine in rural areas given the internet and the digital infrastructure constraints? I don't know. What I do know is that human beings are remarkably adept at spotting opportunities and changing their life strategies. I don't think our way of approaching a lot of these things should be that, look, the last man is not going to get it, so the first man shouldn't get it. I think that's the wrong way of thinking about these questions. In my view, if telemedicine is feasible and useful for some, let's have it open. They will use it, reduce some of the burden on the system, which opens up resources to be able to respond to others in the system, right? That being said, there are a number of different companies that I've been talking to more lately, particularly who are e-pharmacists and in the diagnostic, e-diagnostic space as well, or telediagnostic space. And they've said to me that their penetration in rural areas is, and rural or at least semi-urban areas, is outpacing their growth in metropolitan areas. So my sense is something is happening in the market, but the market is still very young to be able to say it definitively. The suggestions being made are extremely insightful. Thank you, Manya. But do you think our government has the capacity for implementation in such an uncertain situation? It's a great question. I think we have the infrastructure. So for example, for cash transfers or for vouchers, we've done both of these already. So we have a ready-made infrastructure that we can deploy very quickly. The problem area is for us to do the strategic purchasing for negotiating with labs. I think that is a problem to crack, and I think it takes it will take some very smart people to get together and solve this problem. But my sense is that people are raising their hands. In the last 2 weeks, I've spoken to more than 25 different stakeholders in the sector, and every one of them is giving time to the government to help. Sort of come to a negotiation around this. So I remain an optimistic that these are feasible solutions. Due to the worsening economic situation, do we need to fear people coming out in large to protest against the government, like what happened in the US? Chances of anarchy. I am not a soothsayer. Yes, I get nervous about this, which is why I'd like to see us resume economic activity sooner rather than later. That being said, I have no idea how this plays out. Girish asks how to track people and convincing them. Like there are certain areas in which people are a bit hesitant. Yes, like I said, Girish, stigma is a huge issue. I think my response to that is twofold. First is that home-based testing presents a genuine opportunity to be able to solve some of this. Second is really, let's not throw, let's not kill good after the great, right? Let's get as many people who are willing to start. Let's get them in the system. Let's get that going. And slowly, hopefully by observation, by persuasion, we can get the ones who are reluctant into the fold as well. TB and COVID spread mechanism is the same, but COVID spreads very rapidly. So will TB model work? Right. It's a great question. There are similarities and there are differences. I think the differences, though, also point to some salient features. One of the things with TB is that because there was false medication, there was the multi-resistant strain that started to develop very quickly and spread very quickly, particularly in slum areas such as in Bombay. This is where the similarities between TB and COVID start to come in, because you're talking about similar type of geographic communities, you're talking about similar sort of infectious diseases, stigma, a whole bunch of these come together. Now, the difference between TB and COVID also gives us some scope for optimism, which is that the infection rate of each is different. And in the case of COVID, most symptoms tend to be mild. In the case of COVID, most people are, sort of recover and it's fine. So it's not the disease in itself that is deadly, right? Whereas with TB, unless you're on a 9-month program, you're in trouble. In the case of COVID, if you're able to catch it early, get you the assistance quickly, in most cases, you will be fine in a very short span of time. So these are sort of the differences and the similarities that help us think about it. But my nudge to you was not so much the TB treatment protocol. It was to think about how different stakeholders were brought together to solve the problem of private capacity delivering and to solve the who pays problem. This was done really well in TB testing in India. Anas, Yazard, time check. Should I keep going? Because the questions, we still have more questions.
This is a good time to stop. Okay. I know there's some questions. We've already gone 5 minutes over. But thank you so much, Bhuvana. It's been a fantastic discussion. There was a question in chat whether it's possible to post some links or research or further readings. So if you can send some of those to us, we can, send them to everybody registered, so they have these further readings.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're on mute for some reason.
I'm not.
No, we can hear you. Yep. Yep.
I don't think I'm on mute.
Please fill in the feedback form.
Great.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bhuvana.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.